The marble floors of the estate always felt like ice, no matter the season. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master bedroom, watching the rain blur the manicured lawns into a wash of dull green. 3 years of marriage had condensed my life into a string of silent, perfectly choreographed routines. My husband and I shared this cavernous house, moving around each other like two highly polished pieces of furniture, never truly connecting. There was no affection between us. Our union was a strategic alliance, a merging of family assets crafted by board members and sealed with a wedding ring. I had played my part flawlessly, upholding a quiet, unassuming dignity for the sake of the family name. Then came the scent, a sharp, synthetic vanilla, utterly alien to the rich, woody fragrances that filled our home. It clung to the collar of his tailored coat, an unmissable mark. The late-night meetings that dragged on until dawn, the phone screens slammed shut or angled sharply away from my line of sight. These signs were painfully obvious, cliché even. Yet as I held his coat in my hands, I felt no deep sorrow, no tears, no shattering of illusions. Instead, a hollow, bitter absurdity settled in my chest. I had given up my freedom to uphold a perfect family image, only to be made a fool in the most trite way imaginable. The betrayal did not break me. It simply laid bare the suffocating walls of the cage I had agreed to live in. The infidelity was merely the surface of his deception. The true depth of my isolation hit me on a Tuesday afternoon when I opened a mis-delivered envelope from our primary financial institution. It held a summary of leveraged assets, and as my eyes scanned the columns of numbers and fine print, I found it, buried under layers of corporate jargon, a series of massive, high-risk loan guarantees. They were tied directly to the core assets of my family's estate, and they bore my signature. A cold, unrelenting panic closed around my throat. He was systematically draining my family's financial foundation, legally tying me to his reckless gambles. When I confronted my family elders, laying the documents on the table with a clenched hand, their response was a masterclass in cold self-preservation. They urged patience, spoke of the volatile broader market, and stressed the need to keep a united front to avoid stock devaluation. They told me to endure, to swallow the ruin of my own future to protect the polished image of their success. In that moment, a brutal truth settled over me. I was completely, utterly alone. The charity auction was a stage of velvet gowns and hollow laughter. I stood near a towering ice sculpture, a glass of untouched champagne growing warm in my hand, performing the role of the serene, devoted wife. The air reeked of expensive perfumes and calculated networking, every smile a transaction, every word a carefully crafted line. Then she walked into my line of sight. She was an anomaly in the sea of subdued elegance. While other women wore frilly gowns and silk blouses, she had on a sharp, asymmetrical suit, her posture radiating an unapologetic, raw vitality. She did not glide across the room like the rest of us. She walked with purpose, her eyes scanning the crowd with a forensic intensity, as if she was dissecting every lie and pretense. When our gazes met, she did not offer the polite, empty smile of our social circle. She just looked at me, seeing past the facade I'd built. Later, when I sought refuge on a quiet balcony to escape the chaos, she stepped out into the damp evening air. She leaned against the railing, staring out at the city's skyline before turning to me. She noticed the stiffness in my shoulders, the way I held my champagne glass like a shield against the world. Her words were few, no pity in her tone, cutting straight through the heavy fog of my carefully maintained composure. She saw the panic I'd thought I'd hidden perfectly from everyone. She did not let our connection fade after the gala. She found small, unobtrusive ways to cross my path. A brief message passed through a mutual acquaintance, an unexpected presence at a gallery opening I was obligated to attend. Eventually, she extended an invitation to a place far removed from my polished, privileged world, a dimly lit, noisy tavern on the edge of the city, where the air smelled of stale beer and aged wood. I sat across from her at a sticky wooden table, every muscle in my body tensed, defensive and wary. I assumed she was a journalist hunting for gossip, or a corporate spy trying to dig up dirt on my marriage and my family's finances. But she never asked about my husband's affairs. Instead, she slid a folded piece of paper across the table. It was a public record of a shell company, one I vaguely recognized from the documents I'd found at home. She spoke quietly, laying out the intricate mechanics of corporate camouflage, of how my husband was hiding his tracks. She understood the exact trap I was in. She was a freelance forensic consultant, and she hated the power structures that let men use women as collateral for their greed and recklessness. Our meetings became a secret rhythm in my otherwise stagnant life. We met in quiet corners of public libraries, in the back booths of diners that smelled of fried oil and bleach, places no one from my world would ever step foot in. She brought thick, heavily redacted files and cheap, bright highlighters, and she began to dismantle my ignorance piece by piece. She taught me how to read the hidden clauses in binding contracts, how to trace the flow of capital through offshore entities, how to spot the exact tactics my husband was using to siphon my family's assets. Her patience was unwavering. When I stared at spreadsheets, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of his deception, she would tap the paper firmly and redirect my focus, never letting me give up. She chipped away at the polite, compliant upbringing that had kept me blind for so long. For the first time in my life, I held the tools to defend myself. The heavy, suffocating fog that had clouded my judgment for years began to lift, replaced by a sharp, clear clarity. Trust is not a sudden epiphany. It is a slow, painful build of small, consistent acts. I had spent my entire life surrounded by people who saw relationships as nothing more than transactions, who always wanted something in return for every kindness. But she asked for nothing, no payment, no leverage, no favor to be called in later. One evening, rain hammered against the diner's windows, sounding like 1,000 tiny fists against the glass. I was drained, the numbers on the page blurring together, the weight of my family's abandonment pressing down on me like a boulder. I dropped my pen and buried my face in my hands, a silent surrender to the exhaustion and despair. I heard the rustle of her jacket as she moved. She did not offer empty platitudes or meaningless comfort. She simply gathered the scattered papers, stacked them neatly, and placed a steady, firm hand on my shoulder. The warmth of her palm through the fabric of my coat was a physical anchor, grounding me in the moment. In that small, quiet gesture, the defensive walls I had spent decades building cracked open. I realized, with a profound weight, that I was relying on her, that I was trusting another woman with the entire fate of my life, with my ruin or my salvation. My shift in demeanor did not go unnoticed by my husband. I was no longer the docile shadow he expected, the wife who signed whatever papers he put in front of her and never asked questions. I began pressing him with targeted queries about quarterly reports. I refused to sign seemingly harmless tax extensions. I questioned every financial decision he made. His response was swift and cruel, a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. I found the dossier on my vanity table, left open like a taunt. It was filled with heavily doctored emails, blurry photographs, and fabricated bank statements, weaving a devastating narrative. It painted her as an operative paid by a rival conglomerate, tasked with tricking me into revealing my family's internal financial structures. The documents were flawlessly forged, using the exact jargon and formatting she had taught me to recognize. My newfound clarity was turned against me. The very logic she had instilled in me now pointed to her as a traitor. A cold, unrelenting panic settled over me once more. I ended our partnership with the cold precision of the privileged upbringing I had come to despise. I chose a bright, crowded cafe, a public stage where social rules would prevent any loud, messy confrontation. When she arrived, her expression open and ready to keep working, I pushed a copy of the fabricated dossier across the marble table. I did not let her speak. I stood straighter, my tone sharp and cold, channeling the arrogant, unapproachable elite persona I had worn for years. I accused her of treating my crisis like a corporate acquisition, of using me for her own gain. I watched the realization dawn on her face, a brief flash of shock giving way to a hard, impenetrable stoicism. She did not plead her case. She did not argue. She did not even defend herself. She looked at the forged papers, then back at me, her eyes filled with a profound, quiet disappointment. She stood up, leaving her coffee untouched on the table, and walked out the door without a single word. I sat there in the deafening hum of the cafe, my hands clenched tight under the table, having isolated myself completely in the name of self-preservation. I blocked her phone number, erased every digital trace of our meetings, cut all ties. I was back in the cage, and I was alone again. The silence of the estate became a physical weight, pressing down on me at every turn. Without her guidance, the financial documents piling up in my husband's study once again became an undecipherable labyrinth. His endgame was in motion, and he moved with ruthless speed. He initiated the final phase of the asset transfer, filing paperwork that would legally dissolve my family's holdings and leave me as the sole guarantor of his fraudulent debt, leaving me with nothing and everything to lose. My family's attorneys called an emergency meeting, formally advising me to accept a quiet, off-the-books settlement. It would leave me destitute, but it would keep the family name out of criminal courts, protect their precious reputation. I was cornered, with no way out, the air in the room feeling thin and suffocating. I stared at the oak table, and a brutal truth hit me. Cutting her off in an attempt to protect myself had been my final, fatal mistake. I had chosen the familiar comfort of suspicion over the terrifying courage of trust, and it had sealed my ruin. The call from my personal attorney came late on a Thursday evening. His voice crackled with an urgency I had never heard before, all trace of his usual calm professionalism gone. A massive, heavily encrypted data packet had landed in his secure server, sent by an anonymous source. No note, no signature, only a file name that sent a jolt through me. Vindication. I rushed to his office, my steps quick with a desperate hope I hadn't felt in months. The computer screens displayed a devastatingly complete map of my husband's fraud, offshore routing numbers, internal communications confirming the forgery of my signature, hidden ledgers he had kept locked away from the main company accounts, every detail of his scheme laid bare. But it was not just the data itself, it was the way it was organized. The files were labeled, highlighted, and cross-referenced with the exact same meticulous logic she had used during our diner sessions. She had not stopped working, not for a single day. Even after I had humiliated her, even after I had accused her of the very betrayal she had spent weeks fighting against, she had continued her investigation. She had finished building the evidence chain and delivered the weapon I needed, entirely anonymously, making sure I had a way out without asking for any thanks, any vindication, any recognition for herself. It took 2 days to track her down, to a converted warehouse district on the outskirts of the city. I found her on the roof of a parking garage, leaning against the concrete parapet, watching the industrial lights flicker against the dusky sky. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of exhaust and cold metal, cutting through my coat. I stood a few feet away from her, the silence stretching between us, heavy with the weight of my monumental error. There were no dramatic apologies, no tearful confessions. Words felt too small, too inadequate for the harm I had caused. I simply held out a printed copy of the final ledger she had sent my lawyer. She glanced at it, then back at me. I spoke quietly, laying bare the lifelong conditioning of suspicion my family had drilled into me, the fear of betrayal that had blinded me to the only genuine ally I had ever known, the unshakable shame of having doubted her when she had given me everything, her time, her knowledge, her trust, for nothing in return. She listened in silence, her expression unreadable, before she let out a long, slow breath. Her voice was steady as she spoke, explaining that her fight was never just for me. It was against the broken system that let men cage women with impunity, that let them use us as pawns for their greed. She had finished the job because the principal demanded it, she said, but she had sent the evidence to me because I was her friend. She reached out, her hand finding my shoulder just as it had in the diner, a silent reaffirmation of the bond one had tried to destroy. We relocated to a secure hotel room, turning it into a war room. The dynamic had shifted completely. There was no longer a teacher and a student. We were partners, equal in every way. We spent 48 hours straight synthesizing the data, drafting legal injunctions, and crafting a narrative that would leave no room for counterattacks, no way for my husband or the board to weasel out of the consequences. We survived on burnt coffee and convenience store snacks, never pausing to rest, our focus unbroken by fatigue. The synergy between us was absolute. We communicated in half sentences and shared glances, each anticipating the other's analytical leaps and next moves. I navigated the complex social and corporate bylaws of my family's estate, the unwritten rules and power plays only someone raised in that world could understand, while she fortified the forensically undeniable proof of my husband's embezzlement and fraud. We were building a guillotine out of paper and ink, and we knew it would cut deep. In those quiet hours, surrounded by empty coffee cups and glowing computer screens, I felt a profound sense of belonging, a feeling I had never known in the marble halls of the estate. The anxiety that had defined my life for 3 years was gone, replaced by a steady, unyielding strength, forged from pure, unconditional female solidarity. We were ready. The emergency board meeting was a theater of mahogany, leather, and suffocating tension. My husband sat at the head of the table, projecting the calm authority of a man who believed he had already won, his fingers steepled in front of him. The family elders and board members looked at me with veiled impatience, their expressions screaming that they expected my quiet surrender, my acceptance of the settlement. I did not sit. I stood at the opposite end of the table, and with a deliberate hand, I placed the thick, black binder of evidence in the center, a silent challenge. With a calm, measured voice, no hint of emotion in my tone, I began the reckoning. I laid out every detail of his fraud, the offshore accounts, the forged signatures, the deliberate, years-long siphoning of my family's core assets, the way he had planned to leave me holding the bag for his crimes. I watched the color drain from my husband's face, his jaw tightening so hard I thought his teeth would crack, his knuckles white as he gripped the arm of his leather chair. I watched the arrogant, dismissive postures of the board members and elders collapse into panic as they realized their own legal exposure, that they were complicit by their inaction. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout. I did not rage. I simply let the undeniable weight of the evidence, meticulously gathered by the woman they would never have the courage to acknowledge, crush them all. I laid out my terms, clear and non-negotiable. An immediate, uncontested divorce, full and complete restitution of my family's assets, my husband's total resignation from all company positions, and a signed written confession to prevent me from pressing criminal charges. He had no choice but to sign. There was no other way out. The golden cage was finally empty. I walked out of the estate with a single suitcase, leaving behind the ice-cold marble floors, the endless empty rooms, and the cloying scent of expensive lilies forever. My new apartment was modest, in a neighborhood where the sounds of the street, laughter, car horns, children playing, drifted through the open windows, a far cry from the dead silence of the estate. It smelled of fresh paint and aged hardwood, and there was barely any furniture, just 4 bare walls and a floor. She arrived an hour later, carrying 2 cups of cheap, steaming coffee and a box of assorted pastries. We sat on the bare floor, the afternoon sun casting long, warm shadows across the empty room. The silence between us was not heavy or oppressive, as it had always been in the estate. It was the peaceful, exhausted silence of survivors, 2 women who had fought a brutal battle and won. We did not need to talk about the magnitude of what we had achieved, about the way we had taken back control from the men who had tried to break us. The simple act of sitting side by side, breathing the air of a space that belonged entirely to me, free from pretense and obligation, was the only validation we needed. The intricate, exhausting performance of my past life was over. Weeks later, the dust of the legal battle had settled. My ex-husband was ruined, quietly excised from the financial world he had once dominated, his reputation in tatters, no company willing to hire him, no ally left to stand by him. My family, realizing I held the reins of their salvation, that I could have dragged them all into the criminal investigation with a single word, tried to pull me back into their fold, offering me power, money, a return to the privileged life I had left behind. I declined and formally separated my personal assets from their control, cutting all financial ties for good. She and I stood by the window of my apartment one afternoon, looking down at the bustling street below. The trauma of the past 3 years had reshaped me, burning away my passivity and replacing it with a sharp, discerning resilience. I turned to her and proposed a new venture, a new purpose for the bond we had forged in the dark. We would formalize our partnership, I said, and build a consultancy firm dedicated to dismantling the very financial traps that had almost destroyed me. We would offer a lifeline to other women navigating the complex, male-dominated labyrinths of corporate and marital leverage, women who were trapped, as I had been, women who had no one to turn to, women who did not know how to fight back. She smiled, a genuine, fiercely bright expression that matched the raw vitality I had seen in her on the night we first met at the auction. We had forged our bond in the darkest of circumstances, and in that fight, we had discovered the truest kind of strength. It does not come from enduring isolation, from standing alone. It comes from the unyielding, fierce protection of women standing shoulder to shoulder, from lifting each other up, from fighting for each other when no one else will. Our new life was waiting, and we were ready to seize it, together.